Tonight on OTAs News, we discuss retirements, contract extensions, depth chart movement, injuries, holdouts, and Brandon Ayuk's TikTok. Plus, most importantly, what does this mean for your fantasy football team? All on Fantasy First Down. I'm Ben Wasley. Welcome to the Fantasy First Down. If you haven't already, make sure you like and subscribe on YouTube. You can also check us out on Instagram at the Fantasy First Down, on Twitter at Fantasy First Down with no O, and you can find all of my rankings at ffdfantasyfootball.com. Today we're talking about the OTAs, which have been running over the last month or so, and a heap of news has come out, which has a lot of fantasy football impacts. We're going to talk about the different news articles, what they mean for fantasy, and whether we should trust them as good sources of fantasy advice or whether we should just ignore them and go on with our lives. So let's rip into it. I'll basically be going through each of the news things, telling you whether I think it makes any difference, and then telling you what impact it will have on my Dynasty rankings. So we're going to start things off with Kyren Williams. We know he injured his foot at OTAs. He's expected back at July training camp. So this obviously isn't likely to linger into the season. But there's also been a lot of positive news about Blake Corum. Sean McVay talking about 3-down skill sets, how he's really stood out. To me, honestly, Corum's still the backup for Kyren Williams. I have dropped Williams a little bit because these sorts of injuries can linger a little bit, and that just adds to his risk. And anytime a player has increased risk, that's usually a bad thing. So for that reason, I've dropped Williams very slightly in my Dynasty rankings, and I've pushed Corum up a little bit. Clearly, they see Corum as the clear backup, and we kind of knew that, but most importantly, they want him to be a possible every down player, not only if Williams goes down, but potentially to take over from him at some point in time. So that increases Corum's value a lot. Meanwhile, over at the Jets, we see that Bron Allen is clearly taken over as the RB2. I think we all hoped that would be the case when he got drafted, but this is just confirmation that essentially they've said Izzy Abanikanda has been disappointing. He's essentially out of their plans. He's going to be more of a special teams guy. Bron Allen has essentially a possible 3-down role if Breece Hall gets injured. We know that Allen's a big back and he can be used in the red zone, but most importantly, he's gotten a heap of receiving work in OTAs, and they've been really positive about what they've seen. So I think that if you see a Breece Hall injury, all of a sudden Bron Allen becomes a league winner. For that reason, he's one of those handcuffs that you can pick up if you're not planning on starting them, but you still plan on having them on your bench just as an upside option. I think you're not going to see much more upside than Bron Allen. Unsurprisingly, Abanikanda takes a big drop. I think we already knew he was going to drop off a little bit after this. This essentially confirms that he's going to have very little fantasy value moving forward. Keeping with the running backs, and Alvin Kamara left Saints mini camp early. Apparently, he wants a new contract, which is interesting because he's due $18 million this year. I think the biggest issue for him, and I think this is a relevant issue for a lot of the older running backs, is that he doesn't have many guarantees in his contract. And we know that running backs get injured a lot. So he's obviously looking for a situation, not necessarily where he's making more money, but more where he's got a little bit more security long-term and probably also into this season. That's a little bit of a problem because we have seen these things linger into the season before. Players are willing to hold out if they want more guarantees. They're not willing to get themselves injured until they're guaranteed to get paid. So it wouldn't surprise me if Kamara falls down a little bit in the pecking order relative to Miller and Williams. I think the big winner here would be Kendre Miller. The best case scenario for Miller is that Kamara ultimately forces his way out. And I think he's kind of angling for that either this season or next. And that obviously is going to benefit Miller because even though Williams is still going to get his share of touches, especially in short yardage situations, I think Miller kind of becomes the next guy up. He was very disappointing last season, but he's starting to show signs that we might see improvements. There were some good reports about him from OTAs as well. So if Kamara does ultimately force his way out, either this season or next, Miller is a big winner in Dynasty, and obviously these are Dynasty rankings that I'm talking about here. Kamara takes a small drop, firstly because there's always the possibility he'll hold out, and that obviously hurts his fantasy. And secondly, because if he moves to another team, he's not going to get the same quality of usage he does at the Saints. He gets a lot of checkdowns, which is fantastic for PPR. Plus, they really do lean on their running backs because outside Chris Olave, they don't really have anybody else. So I think this hurts Kamara a lot if he ends up out of the way. Now, the chances of that happening are pretty low. So it's only a small shift for both of them, but they're certainly moving closer to each other than they were previously. Another running back that's in a little bit of trouble is Javonte Williams. Cecil Lammey, who has a near 100% success rate when reporting on the Broncos, says that Javonte Williams might not even make the 53 and that Jaleel McLaughlin has a reasonable chance to be the starter. Now, he's also dialed that back a little bit and said he's basically locked in as a change of pace role, but has the potential to grow into the starter. I think this ultimately means good things for both McLaughlin and Audric Esteem, who obviously is their rookie fifth rounder they brought in this year. The general message we're getting is that Javonte Williams is falling down the depth chart. They're not happy with whatever he's putting out there. And Sean Payton has been very clear in saying this is very much a competition for spots in the running back room. And previous performance isn't really what they're looking at. They're looking at what you can offer now. That's going to hurt Williams, who obviously had that top spot locked up for much of last season. Obviously, last season he was coming off injuries, and we hope to see him bounce back this year. This isn't a good sign. Now, to be fair, there's still a lot of off-season and pre-season to come, and it is very possible that Williams earns that top spot back. I certainly think he is the best of the running backs here, but it doesn't matter what I think. It only matters what Sean Payton and the coaching staff think. So if they think that McLaughlin's the better running back, even though he's pretty small, even though he doesn't have experience, even though he was an undrafted guy, if they're willing to give him the snaps, then he's the guy you want for fantasy. So that increases his value. But the fact that we don't clearly know if it's McLaughlin or Esteem or some combination of the two, the fact that Piron's probably still out there on a lot of third downs, and the fact that Williams hasn't actually gone anywhere yet, all of those things hurt everybody's fantasy value in this situation. So Williams takes a sizable drop for me. McLaughlin gets a boost because realistically, I didn't think of him as someone who could potentially be an early down running back before this. And Esteem gets a bit of a boost as well, though not so much because he's not actually the one being mentioned in this news. Now, I think we're all pretty high on Jonathan Brooks going into this season. He is the best of the rookie running backs in what is admittedly a very weak running back class. But there's a lot of concerns around his injury. Obviously, he did his ACL late in the last college season, and he's not likely to be back for training camp, according to Darren Gant. So that's going to hurt his ability to pick up the offense. It also means that he's probably going to be limited in his explosiveness going into the season. I'm not willing to push him too far back, given we still know that once he's back and healthy in the next year or two, he is still going to be an excellent fantasy back. And the fact that they're willing to use him in the passing game, which was a little bit of a concern coming into the season, is a positive thing as well. So ultimately, this is pretty neutral for him. I don't think it has any impact on Miles Sanders either. I think even if Brooks is out, Sanders is still not useful to you in fantasy. The guy who benefits is Chuba Hubbard. And he doesn't benefit a lot, but at least in the first few weeks of the season, we could see a whole lot more Hubbard than we were expecting. And that at least makes him useful if you're in a situation where you desperately need someone to start early in the season, or if you're relying on Brooks to be a starting running back, Hubbard suddenly becomes a valuable backup for you. Hubbard was always going to be a valuable handcuff option anyway. I do think the run game is going to be relatively strong in Carolina, so I'd kind of be interested in having the backup there just in case, because we don't really know how healthy Brooks is going to be going into the season. Now, this isn't really news. Bijan Robinson is going to get the ball in as many ideal situations as possible. That's directly from the horse's mouth. Raheem Morris has said that on the actual Falcons website. Now, they know what the Falcon fans want to hear. They want to hear that their big draft guys, Bijan, Drake London, Kyle Pitts, are actually going to be used properly after the schmozzle of the last couple of seasons. So I think that they're going out of their way to make it clear that that's going to be the case. But that's still good news for fantasy. We kind of thought that was going to be the case, but this essentially confirms that, and that's better than not hearing anything or hearing the opposite. Having said that, Bijan was already my number one running back, so I can't really move him up any higher. I certainly don't think it moves him up relative to the other wide receivers either, so it's a bit neutral on him. It does hurt Tyler Algier a little bit. I thought that potentially he might be used a little bit and certainly be a strong handcuff option. I think he's still a fine handcuff option, but the fact they're not using him at all, the fact that he's not even going to be a bye week filler, is a little bit of a drop in his fantasy value. So Algier takes a slight drop for me, but this is great news for Bijan owners and anyone interested in getting Bijan on their team. Another guy who gets a little bit of a boost, and this time it does actually push him up the rankings, is RoShaun Stevenson. He signed a pretty big, for a running back, 4-year contract extension. This is a bit surprising for a guy that I think is 26 already. This will take him till he's about 30. Now, obviously, there's not guarantees all the way through, but that's big money for a running back. They did just bring Antonio Gibson in. I think there were some thoughts that maybe potentially he would take a bit of a chunk of work away from Stevenson. This is signaling that that's not going to be the case. This is saying, hey, RoShaun Stevenson is our guy. We're going to be hanging with him for at least the next few years. Now, we know the Patriots are going to suck, but that doesn't mean they're going to have no run game. They've had a pretty solid run game for some time now, and I expect that to remain the case. I think they're going to be pretty run heavy. He's not going to be efficient, but he's going to get a lot of touches, and I think probably a lot of checkdowns as well. So that's going to increase his value. He jumps up well into the top 20 running backs for me. Antonio Gibson takes a little bit of a dent because there's far less chance of Gibson actually taking over the lead role without a Stevenson injury. Now, there's still a chance that it could happen because of an injury, and he still certainly could be involved on 3rd and longs and other passing downs. But I do think that for the most part, this is going to be Stevenson's backfield unless something strange happens. And that's worse than what we thought previously, where there was the potential, at least, for Gibson to take the job away from Stevenson. I don't think that's going to be happening in the next year or two with this contract or if a new coaching staff comes in. So this means at least something to me. Now let's talk wide receivers. We know that T. Higgins signed the franchise tag. That's not news. We kind of thought that might happen. But that to me is still good news because the alternative was that potentially he holds out or he goes to another team. And I don't really know that there's many teams he could go to where he'd be the clear number one with a good quarterback and actually improve in fantasy value. I think this is probably the best case scenario for him. He continues to be an elite number 2 receiver in a good offense with a very good quarterback and a very good number 1 who removes a lot of attention from him. We saw him get very busy last season, even with poor quarterback play from Jake Browning. So I think with Joe Burrow back, with Jamar Chase able to take the bulk of the looks, that means that T. Higgins can thrive in that deputized role. I think that's going to be really useful for fantasy. He becomes a low-end wide receiver too. He kind of already was in this range, but this certainly helps the fact that he's not going to drop down due to going to a worse team or going into an uglier situation. So Higgins gets a small boost for me, doesn't really impact the other guys at all. Now, this one has minimal impact on fantasy, but a lot of you will have drafted Malaki Corley in your rookie drafts, and this kind of hurts a little bit. There's been a pretty clear report that Xavier Gibson is the number 3 guy at the moment. Corley's going to be used in the slot a little bit, but he's essentially more of a gadget player and a returner. Now, we do know that the return game is going to be a lot more valuable in fantasy this year, but unless you're getting a lot of points for return yards, that's not something you actually want for fantasy. So for that reason, this kind of hurts Corley's value a little bit. It kind of changes the way we can look at why they brought him in. I do still think that ultimately he'll probably win out in the number 3 role, but the fact that that's not clear cut at this time of the season is a problem. That adds a lot of risk that you don't ideally want. So Corley takes a drop, Gibson comes up. I do think by halfway through the season, we'll probably see Corley in that number 3 role. He'll spend a lot of time in the slot. But I do think that this suggests that he's not necessarily going to be an every down 3rd wide receiver, that we will see some Gibson, and that his value to the team is going to come a lot more in special teams and other styles of plays rather than being a clear top receiving option. This is also a bit of an issue when you consider that Mike Williams isn't necessarily going to be healthy. And I'd kind of hoped that Corley would ultimately step into that wide receiver 2 role at some point. I think this limits the possibility of that happening. I think this tells us that Gibson's still going to remain quite involved, and that certainly they don't see Corley as an outside receiving option, at least at this stage. So that lowers his value relative to a lot of those other players that just have a little bit more upside. Now, the 49ers don't want Ayuk back, according to Brandon Ayuk himself. He had a conversation with Jaden Daniels randomly, and it was very clear in saying the 49ers don't want him back. Now, you can read a lot into this and why he's doing this and what it means. Firstly, does he mean they don't want him back this season? Presumably not. He's still under contract. He's clearly a good player. He's one of the best blocking wide receivers in the NFL. I think they probably means they're not willing to pay him enough money for next season. I think it would be crazy to think they're not willing to offer him a contract at all. He's probably their best wide receiver weapon. But I do think that he's trying to suggest that they don't value him sufficiently. And because they're not offering him a contract that he feels is fair, they're basically saying, well, you don't actually want me back. You're not willing to pay the amount I deserve. Now, what does that mean for Ayuk? Well, firstly, it probably means he's gone at the end of this season. These things don't always work out that way, but there's certainly a high risk that he's moving. I do think he'll probably see out this season with the 49ers, but we have seen him end up in the 49ers doghouse before, and that really changed the way they used his usage. So there's the risk of that happening, plus there's the risk of him going somewhere else after this season. And most other offenses aren't going to be as beneficial for Ayuk as the 49ers are. The 49ers have one of the best offenses in the league. They're very aggressive. They filter the ball through very specific plays. They don't spread it out as much. They've got a solid quarterback, but very good play calling. I think this is the situation that's best for him. Going anywhere else is only going to hurt him. So he takes a small drop for me. Deebo Samuel gets a boost of a spot or two, simply because I think this could mean, I think there's a reasonable chance that if not this season, next season, he becomes the top wide receiver. He kind of was already getting pretty good usage. I don't think the usage is going to jump much, but it certainly helps him. But the guy this helps the most is Ricky Pearsall. I think there was a significant chance that we'd end up in a situation where Ricky Pearsall is the wide receiver 3 for the long term. Now, to be fair, you could argue, well, they used a first-round pick on him. That doesn't mean that they don't see him in their future plans. I think they realize they need 3 good wide receivers, and so bringing Pearsall in makes sense. The fact that they're not really valuing Ayuk presumably means that they're thinking of Pearsall as someone that can step into one of their stud wide receiver roles in the future. That really increases his value. Now, Ayuk's not out the door yet, and this might turn around and might change a lot. So that doesn't necessarily mean that Ayuk won't stay, and you can't rank Pearsall as equivalent to an Ayuk or a Deebo Samuel yet. He's not in that role yet, but he's moving in that direction, hence he moves up my rankings. All of these things come with some sort of risk. You need to think about what element of risk you're willing to take and how much upside you want. Pearsall has plenty of upside if he can actually get into that role, but it won't happen this year, and we don't know what's going to happen in the future because players who can't take advantage in their first year, it doesn't always come around later on in their career. So there is still plenty of risk with Pearsall. I still like guys like Xavier Legette better, but he certainly jumps up my rankings a little bit. From my 11th rookie overall, I think he's up to my 9th rookie wide receiver now. And certainly he moves up relative to non-rookies as well. Now, another former rookie that I liked quite a lot but didn't get the usage I hoped is finally looking like he might be the starting wide receiver for the Browns. We kind of assumed this would be Elijah Moore, and while it had little value last year and Jerry Jeudy does arrive, I think we always thought that Moore had enough talent that he might be able to make it work. I just don't think that's going to happen. I think Elijah Moore has turned into a gadget special teams guy, or he's fallen down the depth chart so much that he's going to end up on another team at some point in time. I think this really hurts his value, and I think they do legitimately mean to use Tillman on the outside. They've got enough slot options now with Jerry Jeudy in there. I think it makes sense to have a true outside guy in the day 2 pick in Cedric Tillman on the outside. This helps Tillman's value. He goes from being someone you don't even want on your roster to being at least a late roster option in deeper leagues. I still got him ranked below Elijah Moore because I do think that Moore's a more explosive player and he's got more upside. I find it hard to see Tillman turning into a stud fantasy player. But if you're in a really deep league and you're looking down into the 90s of my wide receiver rankings, so it'd have to be a pretty deep league, Tillman's at least someone who's going to start for you. So even though he doesn't have that same amount of upside, he's probably got a little bit more security based on this report. Now, you have to take any report with a grain of sand, but I do think it is reasonable to suspect that Tillman could be the starting outside guy. I don't think that's out of the bounds of possibility. It's just also possible it might be some sort of committee situation, so don't go all in on Tillman at any point in time. Let's talk about quarterbacks. Russell Wilson took the majority of first-team snaps at OTAs. Now, you could argue, well, he's the older player, so he gets seniority. I mean, maybe, but they're two veterans coming in. It's not like we're talking about a newly drafted player. Justin Fields has been around for a while. So there's two guys coming in who are both veteran players. I think it would have been entirely reasonable for the team to split the snaps 50-50 and say this is an actual competition. That's not what we're hearing. We're hearing pretty clear reports from a number of places that Wilson is likely to be the starter unless something changes. We're not saying, oh, something will naturally develop and Fields will get a chance. We're saying Fields will need to take over from Wilson. And Fields hasn't looked good in OTAs from all reports. And Wilson has looked solid. He's looked fine. This is a team who is able to hold onto the ball a little bit more, which helps Wilson because they've got a solid O-line. And I feel like he could fit into this system a little bit better. Justin Fields has just generally been pretty disappointing as a passer for some times now. And I do think that Wilson is likely to be the starter moving forward. So I have moved him past Fields in my Dynasty rankings. I already thought he was likely to be the starter, but this extra security means that even though Wilson is a whole lot older and has less fantasy upside as a starter, I do think that he's likely to be the clear starter for much of next season, probably for all of next season. And I think that we're seeing that Justin Fields might just turn out to be a career backup until he gets another opportunity down the road. That really hurts his fantasy value. We know that his rushing floor is great, but if no team is willing to start him, he suddenly becomes useless to us. So Fields is not someone I would necessarily drop in all leagues, but certainly if you're not in a super flex league or a super deep league, there's not really any reason to hang on to Fields, but he's probably not playing this year. And that's kind of useless bench spot that you could take up with somebody else. I'm also not saying you should go out of your way to get Wilson either. I think he has limited fantasy value too. This whole offense is very run heavy. I don't think it's going to be particularly productive for fantasy, especially for the quarterback. So I don't particularly want either of them. But in a super flex league where every quarterback has value, I think Wilson's probably the guy to own. Sam Darnold, meanwhile, is the number one quarterback for the Vikings at the moment. Now, I think we kind of knew that was going to be the case. This is generally what happens with veterans and rookies. Generally, the veteran will be the number one until the rookie starts to take over. But usually that starts to happen during OTAs and we start to get some positive reports. Certainly, Caleb Williams is considered the clear number one in Chicago. Jaden Daniels already seems to be the clear number one in Washington, even though they haven't come out and said that. So I certainly expected to see some sort of positive reports about JJ where they're talking about it being a competition or something like that. That's not what Kevin O'Connell said. He said, if we went into the season now, Sam Darnold would be the number one guy. It would be Sam Darnold's offense. So that means that you're not expecting JJ to necessarily start out of the gate. That's actually not bad for a lot of the pass catching options here. I certainly think they'd be willing to have Darnold air it out a little bit more than they would with a rookie. So this helps Justin Jefferson a little bit. It helps Jordan Addison a little bit. But mostly it hurts JJ McCarthy. I honestly couldn't move him much further down because there was a big gap originally between 20 and 21 for me. But he does move down relative to a lot of other positions. Certainly it hurts his value. And if you're someone who's trying to win now and you drafted JJ as a guy who is valuable to you right now, I do think this kind of hurts his chances of having that value for you. I think you might need to think about, if you're in a super flex league, you need to start it. Maybe you need to pick up a Sam Darnold just to make sure that you're getting one of those two guys. Because whoever's starting for the Vikings, you think would have some sort of fantasy value. This also means that if you're in a situation where you're not trying to win now, or you really need a rookie, and you're not desperate to have someone starting at this very moment, Michael Penix certainly becomes into the conversation a lot more than he did previously. The previous benefits of JJ McCarthy and Bo Nix was both that we expect them to be fantasy starters straight away, and that Penix is arguably the better player in a slightly better situation, but he's going to have to wait behind Kirk Cousins. I still think that Penix will have to wait behind Kirk Cousins, although Walt from World of Football has been saying to me that he thinks it's entirely possible Penix still starts week one. I don't think that's the case, but I do think that both JJ and Bo Nix are at risk of not starting week one because we've had similar reports around Bo Nix potentially being behind Jarrett Stidham. Jarrett Stidham running his own training camps with all the receivers. He's really gunning for that number one spot as well. So I don't think it's a clear cut. JJ will start, Bo Nix will start, Michael Penix is going to wait a year or two. I think it's more ugly than that, and for that reason, both McCarthy and Nix drop for me, but McCarthy in particular, and Penix relative to them rises a whole lot closer. And if you're in a situation where you're not trying to win now, I prefer Penix over both of those guys. Trevor Lawrence signed a 5-year extension. That's good news because I think there was a reasonable risk based on his play that he was going to fall out of favor with the team. Clearly, I was wrong. Clearly, the team values what he's been doing. I don't know why. He hasn't been fantastic, but he's clearly talented, and they clearly think of him as being their franchise guy. So that gives me a lot more confidence that he's going to have a starting job for the long term. It's an explosive offense with a lot of good pass catches. They clearly want to pass the ball plenty. So I think regardless of what happens, Lawrence is the starting guy. That increases his dynasty value. He was my QB 12 last time I did my rankings, but I'd started dropping down a little bit because I was getting more and more nervous about how the team sees him. I'd been looking a lot more into his play, and it was uglier than I'd remembered. But the fact that they're giving him this extension means that I'm willing to keep him as my QB 12 and give him a little bit more security there. I don't think this makes much difference for Brian Thomas and Christian Kirk and the other receivers. I don't think Lawrence is so good that he's significantly better than the other options that they could have had. But it's at least fine news for them. It's a good thing that they at least have the same quarterback for the long term, especially for Thomas, who's going to have a couple of years with Lawrence moving forward. Now let's talk about tight ends. The biggest tight end news, Darren Waller retiring from the NFL. I did talk about this a little bit when I went through the Giants in my fantasy deep dives. If you haven't checked those out, I did a deep dive on every single team, broken up into divisions, about 10 to 15 minutes on every team. Go check those out on the YouTube channel. Waller is no longer in the NFL. Someone needs to take over as the starting tight end. Who will it be? I don't think anybody. I think this is probably going to be a committee situation. I think we see plenty of Bellinger out the door and Theo Johnson slowly works his way in. And this turns into one of those ugly tight end committees we're seeing become more common across the league. I think we probably see Bellinger doing slightly more of the blocking work. Johnson starts to become a bit more of the receiver. Neither of them become particularly fantasy valuable. Having said that, they both have the upside of being a fantasy starter. For that reason, I moved them both up in my rankings, but neither of them are in a situation where you're going to be drafting them in most leagues. I did a mock draft on CBS Sports last night for me anyway, this morning for you. And Theo Johnson was taken in a dynasty league around the 10th or 11th round, which seemed crazy to me. He was about the 18th tight end off the board. I think a lot of people are going to get a little bit aggressive in trying to go get him. If you have Theo Johnson and you're getting good offers for him, trade him away. The upside is not there. It is not clear who's going to have the starting role here. It very easily could be Bellinger. Johnson's a late round tight end, and they don't hit very often. So for that reason, I'm not particularly interested in Johnson. I think he's probably got more value in selling him than he does in keeping him on your team. Now, another interesting tight end situation, Cecil Lammey, who, as I said, very accurate with Broncos reporting, has said that Lucas Krull could be the starting tight end for the Broncos. Now, that doesn't mean a lot for Krull. He wasn't someone that you probably wanted on your rosters anyway, unless you're in like a 32-team league. And I'm in a few, and they're very fun. I recommend them. But unless you're in one of those leagues, you're not getting Lucas Krull and putting him on your roster. The upside isn't there. Because even though there's a chance of this happening, it's far from locked in. This hurts Greg Dulcich. Now, to be fair, to me, Dulcich wasn't already that high because I did think this was probably going to be a committee where Troutman takes the early downs and Dulcich is out there on third downs. But this now suggests to me that potentially it could be neither of those things. It could be a three-way committee. It could be Krull taking over Dulcich's role altogether. This hurts Dulcich a lot for me. He drops down quite a few spots. He's now someone I don't particularly want on my roster. He's in that similar situation as the Johnsons and Bellingers I talked about previously, where there is a very reasonable chance that he's not going to be fantasy relevant at any point. That's not someone you particularly want on your roster. So I'm essentially avoiding most Broncos in most situations. I think this offense is going to be pretty rubbish. Not everyone is on board with that. I know that some people, Cecil Lammey himself, has talked about them getting potentially 9 wins, which I think is insane. I would be happy with 2 or 3 if I were them. I think their offense is really going to struggle. They don't have the weapons. I don't want any of these guys at all. Jwan Johnson had foot surgery, and apparently he'll struggle to be ready for week 1. Although the next day we then got a report saying he will be ready for week 1. Regardless, this hurts him a little bit. Anytime you have any sort of surgery, there is always the possibility of complications. I know we say he should be ready for week 1, but this is a worse situation than someone who's healthy and is going to play all the way through training camp into preseason and then into the season. So this certainly hurts his value. So I've moved Johnson slightly down my rankings. I've given Tyson Hill a slight boost because if Johnson goes down, I think that Hill gets enough tight end relevant steps to help him. Hill would be high, but he's 33. So unless you're someone who is trying to win now and needs a high upside tight end, because Hill can have those big weeks, I'm not particularly interested in Taysom Hill. We did get some news that in OTAs he was getting used out of the backfield. Now, to be fair, teams do all sorts of insane stuff in OTAs. That's very normal for them to do all sorts of crazy stuff using players in weird roles. But it wouldn't surprise me if this is like the next transition for Taysom Hill, that he starts getting used out of the backfield more, that they use him a bit as a running back rather than taking direct snaps. Then he can go out and run routes as well. I think that opens up some possibilities for him, and it opens up some possibilities for the team. So I could see that as being something that might happen, slightly increases his value for me. He also moves up naturally because a few other players have moved down after Waller's retirement and also after Dolchich moving down. But I do think this helps Hill a little bit. Jwan Johnson moves down a little bit simply because I don't like any sort of injury risk at all. Travis Kelce plans to play through his new 2-year contract. Well, of course he did. That's why he signed a 2-year contract. I don't think this is surprising news, but he also could have said nothing. So I think this is better than saying nothing. We do know that Kelce is someone that tends to be a little bit of an open book with this sort of thing. He doesn't just say things for the sake of saying them. He kind of thinks about what he's saying. So I think he probably means this, but plenty of players have meant stuff and then changed their mind later on. So I don't think this means that you can be locked in to 2 years of Travis Kelce. I think it also hurts a little bit because he didn't say, oh, I'm not done. I want to keep playing indefinitely. He is kind of giving himself a little bit of a time limit, and that hurts a little bit too. If you're someone who's trying to win now, Kelce's still a top 3 tight end, but he does have significantly less value in Dynasty because he's not going to be around in a couple of years' time. So this is better than nothing, but I also don't think it's the best case scenario, and it doesn't really move the dial much for me at all. Pat Freiermuth has had a great connection with Russell Wilson. As we said, Wilson is probably the starting quarterback in Pittsburgh. Now, to be fair, Freiermuth is someone I found pretty disappointing last season. I was hoping to see a lot better from him, but all reports have said he's been the star of OTAs. Now, to be fair, padless practices aren't exactly that exciting, but when you've had a season like Freiermuth's, having those reports is significantly more positive than them saying, wow, darn it, Washington's all of a sudden catching the ball a heap, or Connor Hayward is all of a sudden the new guy in their tight end room. The fact that they're talking about Freiermuth and no one else is good for his role. And it's probably generally good for his fantasy value because I would expect them to use their tight ends a lot. Their new OC uses their tight ends at a very high amount. So I think that probably helps Freiermuth. All of those things combined have just moved him up a spot for me. That's not so much based on this news, but just a general accumulation of feelings that Freiermuth is actually someone who's going to be useful this season, whereas Cole Kmet drops down because all of a sudden they've got a whole heap of wide receivers in that room. There's also talk that Calvin Austin could have a big role. Now, what a big role looks like could be anything. Mary Kay Cabot's actually pretty good with the accuracy of her reporting, so this means something, but a big role could mean he's the kick returner. He just happens to be their slot running back. I don't think this influences me enough that I'd go, well, I don't want Roman Wilson anymore. We knew there needed to be a third wide receiver, and it didn't seem to be anyone else. I think it was probably naturally going to be Austin anyway. But I've given Calvin Austin a slight boost because there is at least a possibility this signals that he could be the wide receiver too, at least out of the door. I do think the Steelers have an excellent history of developing their wide receivers. So I do think that Wilson probably is someone you still want in your team. But this certainly helps Austin a little bit, gives me a little bit more hope. There's at least some value in his future. In most leagues, you're still not rostering him. I want Roman Wilson over him by a lot. And that's all we've got. That is OTA's news. I hope you've enjoyed our look through all of the news and reports from the most recent OTAs. Make sure you hang out, like, subscribe, check out our other videos. I'll be posting some more stuff in the coming days. You can also check us out on Instagram at the Fantasy First Down, on Twitter at Fantasy First Down with no O, and all of my rankings are on the website at ffdfantasyfootball.com. I've also done some videos over on Razzball, and I'll be doing another one in the next couple of days. You can check out all of my videos that aren't on YouTube and also all of my articles by going to the website as well. I've got a list of all those things up there. I hope you enjoyed the rest of your weekend, and I'll catch you in the next couple of days for more fantasy football content.